Dr. Anthea, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for speaking to us. In that brief, we've talked about matriculants or other learners that are teaching young learners. What is the situation on the ground from what you understand?
Well, what was reported in a news article much earlier this week was part of the repercussions of the proposed cuts, the necessary cuts, and we just discussed what would be some of the implications. And one of those would be greater use of unqualified people to supplement where there are shortages. And as I had said, we are already in some places using former students who have done well in particular subjects to come back and help their old schools or even other schools in the neighborhood with the more difficult subjects where children need extra tuition and the teachers themselves perhaps are not 100% qualified up to the grade level that's required. So the cuts would make things worse. But I think moving the conversation on a little bit, because it is connected with the cuts, would be other increased implications, and that would be greater teacher absence. And there has recently been some release of data about stress levels of teachers being very, very high, and the percentage of patients being seen in clinics and treated for depression and so on, very high because of stress, because of overload in their work. Some of the conditions in the schools are not conducive to good mental health. And so we have quite a high level of teacher absence. So if you add post cuts, plus an increase of teachers' absence because of more stress, because of greater workload, we start to make the problem even more difficult. And then another matter is also, why are these students, former learners, coming in to teach? Because often it takes too long for proper appointments to be made. So a vacancy occurs, but then there's a process which has to be followed. Usually a departmental process, but sometimes school governing body processes. They want to do it in an accountable fashion and advertise and interview properly. All of that takes time. And so you then have children sitting while a vacancy is still being filled and a process is being followed. So that's another reason why unqualified people step in.
So who
to
pays,
fill gaps sometimes.
Dr. Anthea, who pays these unqualified personnel? Because I'd imagine that ordinarily the Department of Basic Education, if that's at the department, would ensure a monthly payment of normal or regular teachers. But who's sorting out the payment of these young individuals, for want of a better description, I suppose?
Well, that is an interesting question. Sometimes no payment. Sometimes these students do it as voluntary service, and on other occasions the school would pay a very small stipend. If the person was planning to become a teacher, then they could pay a stipend and could go into a memorandum of understanding with the education SETA and a higher education institution, and they do a proper learnership. That happens sometimes, and then it's a three-way partnership, and then there is funding for the student in terms of that, and they are described as a learnership, and the school would then pay. That would come out of school funds. So only schools that have got money available can actually pay people. And the shortages are often in areas where there isn't a lot of money. They rely on the government transfer allocation because they're no-fee schools. They're not allowed to charge fees. They can only do fundraising. And so they do some fundraising, and maybe some of the fundraising money gets diverted to give these students a little bit of payment. They're not getting paid teachers' salaries by any means. They're getting paid probably minimum wage type payments. And they don't come in necessarily for whole school days even. They might come in only for a couple of hours a day, and maybe not even every day. it's a very informal arrangement, and it very much contextually determined. The fact of the matter is, schools try to put somebody in the front of the classroom to get on with teaching the curriculum, because the curriculum is long and no time can be wasted. So schools try their best, and many have resorted to using students. And sometimes they're very good. And you probably know about the Presidential Youth Initiative. And in that initiative, some of the people that were sent to schools, also just getting a very small stipend, actually were qualified teachers. So they were doing it for the stipend, but they actually were qualified. And some would be qualified in the actual subjects. But mostly,
so Dr. Anthea, if you allow me to come in, it's obviously a good thing that these young individuals who might be considering going into teaching, or just have an ability to be able to fill in the gap, so to speak, and that's absolutely marvelous. But there are also issues of accountability, right? So if my daughter or my son fails the matric, I can go back to the school and hold them accountable if I feel that they did not do what was right, if the teaching process, for instance, if they did not acquit themselves as they should. So what happens in the instance where there is a volunteer, so to speak, who comes into the system and doesn't quite do what he or she is expected to do, or do as well as a regular teacher?
Well, that's a very important question to ask, but it actually applies whether the teachers are qualified or not qualified. There isn't a comeback. You know, I haven't, maybe there are cases, but I haven't heard of a case where a parent has come back to the school and, you know, said, you failed my child because you didn't deliver quality education. Perhaps if there was more of that, we would become more accountable in terms of the quality of teacher performance across the board. And I'm talking across the board, qualified ones included. But it doesn't happen. But, you know, it is the department's responsibility to monitor curriculum delivery. And they do. They go to schools, they check the work of the teachers, they check the assessments that learners have done. They check that the standard that the assessment was set at has been marked correctly by the teachers, and that the mark awarded to the learner is reflective of the learner's current level of understanding. So there are assessment and accountability measures in place. So much of the unqualified teaching conduct is going on in an unreported fashion. But if the department, this is a department responsibility, provincial department, not national, provincial department, to have their subject facilitators or advisors visiting schools, checking that their schools are keeping up with the curriculum delivery. So there are checks and balances in place.
Now speaking of checks and balances, can school governing bodies make use of these student learners, or student teachers, if you will, in order to fill in the gaps? Because it's clear from what you're indicating that the system is a very, very slow system in filling these vacancies. But the vacancies have to be filled, and the learners need to learn. The teacher could decide not to come back 2 months before an exam.
Yes, and this happens, or they take ill, seriously ill, or die, or, you know, something really bad happens, and there's a sudden vacancy. School governing bodies, in terms of the Schools Act, may only employ qualified educators. They have to be registered with the South African Council for Educators. That's the law. So if
this suggests, sorry, Doctor, that those that are doing it at the moment are breaking the law then?
Yes, if they are putting an unqualified, like a 20-year-old in a classroom with other 18 to 20-year-olds to teach mathematics, and there isn't another qualified person in the room, it would not be all right. If there were another teacher present as the teacher, and this good mathematician, let's say, help the teacher do the job. So you had a qualified person in the room, governed by the code of ethics of the council, etc. But this particular learner who understood how to teach maths, what we call pedagogical content knowledge, knowing how to teach a subject, was doing it in the presence of, let's say, another teacher. The life orientation teacher was sitting there and maintaining classroom order and discipline. And this other person was filling in a gap of a missing mathematics teacher. I think we would have to let it be an understandable need that's been fulfilled.
Certainly some...
Those grades need to know mathematics. They need to be kept safe. So if a school can put in place a measure to keep the learners safe under the control of an officially registered person, it would probably pass as a temporary measure.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave that conversation. Dr. Anthea Cereseto, CEO of Governing Body Foundation.